Hi, I'm Tzvi Langermann, and I'm here to talk about Al-Ghazali's purported influence on Maimonides, or more specifically, to debunk as best I can some of the more recent claims that Al-Ghazali influenced Maimonides. My talk will be very much about methodology because one of my main points is that the term influence is so mushy, so amorphous, so fleeting, so slippery that it's hard to get a hold of it, and you can't really discuss, engage, and if necessary, falsify a claim unless you can first see what the claim is in hard terms. And in fact, I will be devoting time to two papers which are, to their great credit, make specific claims which one can falsify. So even though I'll be criticizing their authors, in fact, I think they deserve the greatest amount of credit in this whole saga for at least having made specific claims that one can grab hold of and examine. Some of the others are so sort of mushy and slippery and wispy that it's very hard to tackle them. The other issue that will be coming up in a more sort of general sense of what goes on in academia is what I call social negotiation. I don't call it, it's a term I picked up. It means basically the following, that there is a trend now. There's the slew of papers which claim that Maimonides was influenced by Al-Ghazali. None of them have brought any solid evidence. Almost all of them open or along the way make a statement to the fact that Maimonides never mentions Al-Ghazali, which is true. They never cites by name a work of Al-Ghazali, which is true. That there's no single passage in any of Maimonides' writings that can be identified as a quote or even as a close paraphrase of Al-Ghazali, which is true. Nonetheless, the fact that there are more and more papers that sort of suggest, more forcefully, some less forcefully, that Al-Ghazali did influence Maimonides, makes it easier for the next person in line to advance the claims. The first person who I think made a detailed investigation into this topic, and she was certainly someone qualified, was the late Kabbalat Yafa, who was not one of the great authorities on Ghazali for a generation, not maybe a great scholar of Maimonides, but certainly someone who was very well versed in Ghazali's writings, which, as I'm sure you all know, are multifarious and wide-ranging, and of course some are of disputed authorship. She basically started from scratch and came, not surprisingly, to negative conclusions. But the more recent work doesn't really have to make an effort to sort of say that Ghazali's influence by Maimonides is well known or discussed in here and there, and so they can sort of carry on from that without having to really attack the fundamental question of whether Maimonides was really influenced by Ghazali at all. This paper or this video will also give me a chance to say something which I think is of more direct relevance to your topic this summer in terms of the overall impact of Ghazali on Jewish writers of the Middle Ages, or his Jewish audience, or if you wish, the place of Ghazali's writings, or some of them, on the Jewish bookshelf. This is relevant because of a methodological principle that I apply in this particular topic, which is the following, that the more evidence we have that a certain work was read by and utilized and appreciated by Jewish authors, the less suspicious we have to be about claims of its having an influence. So, for example, as I'll be saying shortly, some of Ghazali's writings, most notably his Intentions of the Philosophers, Maqasid al-Falasifa, certainly had a tremendous impact. Was it for some time the basic textbook for which people learned the basics of medieval philosophy. And so had anyone advanced the claim that the Maqasid had an influence on Maimonides, I would be less suspicious. But on the other hand, other writings of his, such as Ihya al-Ulumuddin, have no presence at all in Jewish literature up to and including the time of Maimonides, and therefore the claim that Maimonides was influenced by them demands even closer inspection, is much more suspicious, much more requiring of demanding of evidence and susceptible to refutation. Hand in hand with this, I will be saying something about the resources that are available to scholars, and I'm sorry to say the way they are not exploited by the studies that I have seen on this. We have at least two tremendous online resources, which should be the first thing that anyone consults when undertaking a project of this. If I wanted to know, for example, before engaging to the specific question as to whether Maimonides was influenced by the Ihya al-Ulumuddin, of course, on the presumption, on the fact that no one disputes that he never ever cites it, I would want to know, well, is there any evidence at all of it being used by Jewish writers? We have two resources that can be exploited here. One is the online catalog of the Institute of Microfilmed Hebrew Manuscripts in Jerusalem, where in fact I worked for over a decade, full-time cataloging manuscripts, which gives us an excellent picture of the presence of Ghazali on the Jewish bookshelf. And we have now the online searchable database of the Geniza, of most of the Geniza, much of the Geniza in the Freebird collection. The Geniza here is particularly important. Of course, people are always saying Geniza, 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 and maybe that's not always the case that it's that important. But for this topic in particular, it's important because the Geniza not only comes from Cairo, but it has been shown to preserve Maimonides' personal library. We have here his rough drafts or parts of his drafts of his guide. We have here medical writings and books from the Galenic corpus that were in his library. So let us say that if Maimonides had a copy of the Ihya al-Ulumuddin or Munkathun al-Dalal, and there would be a good chance that it would have been deposited in the Geniza, even if it's not a work by a Jewish author, because they preserved books by Muslim and Greek authors. And neither of these resources have been exploited or even touched in the studies that I have seen. Now, as I said, I went through them thoroughly to make sure that I could state categorically, particularly with regard to the Ihya al-Ulumuddin, Ghazali's tremendous work encompassing not just Muslim law and theology, but some Sufism and things of that sort, just to be sure that I could confirm what I'd thought all along after having worked in the field of manuscripts for many long years, and confirm that there is no evidence whatsoever of it having been available up to and including the time of Maimonides. I say up to and including the time of Maimonides because Paul Fenton, who was a reliable scholar, has found in a fifth-generation descendant of Maimonides what he considers, what he finds to be citations or paraphrases of the Sufi sections from the Ihya al-Ulumuddin, but it will be a tremendous leap of faith, which a serious scholar would not make, to say that if they were found in his fifth-generation descendant who had moved to Aleppo and who had gone off on a very different tangent from Maimonides, and who cites and uses many, many works, mostly Sufi works, that Maimonides doesn't cite, to make a leap of faith and say, well, Maimonides, he must have inherited that from Maimonides is ridiculous, particularly since Maimonides' own son, Abraham, who is not known to have cited from Ghazali, and we have a document in the Geniza discussing his the books that he had inherited or bestowed. So there is no evidence whatsoever for the Ihya having been read by any Jewish scholar up to and including Maimonides, and this can be certified. And it's a shame that the people working on Ghazali haven't done this. Now, of course, it's not out of the question that Maimonides would have read things that no one else had read. As a matter of fact, I can I can ascertain that he did from fields of my own specialty in history of science. He was the only person in the world we know of to have read Ibn al-Haytham's attempt to reconstruct the 8th book of Apollonius Conics. He cites in the guide some books on astronomy that are lost, and no one else, we don't know if we have no other source for them. And he cites some books of at least one book of Galen that is otherwise lost. So he was certainly very well read. I think he availed himself of the tremendous libraries in Fatim and Cairo when he first came there. And it's not out of the question that he would be the only person to have read a certain book, but the claim that he's influenced by Ihya al-Ulumuddin in particular certainly requires much more closer investigation than, say, had someone claimed he was influenced by the Maqasid. I'll have something I would say about the Maqasid and Maimonides later on. So, overall, this is the general trend that the tack of my talk. I would just say now that in the great bibliographer Marge Steinschneider, who, despite having published his work over a century ago, is still really the great authority. And his books on the translations of Arabic texts to Hebrew and the Hebrew transcriptions of Arabic texts and Hebrew letters and on the Arabic literature of the Jews are still indispensable reference works. Went through Al-Ghazali pretty thoroughly. He doesn't mention Ihya al-Ulumuddin even in the index of his book on the Hebrew translations. And so there's no reason there. If Steinschneider didn't see anything anywhere, that sort of lets us know that it's not very likely that that this book of Ghazali was read. What was read by Ghazali? Well, as I mentioned, mainly the Maqasid, intentions of the philosophers. There are about 180 entries under Ghazali's name in the Institute of Microfilm Hebrew Manuscripts, and about a third of them are the Maqasid, mostly in Hebrew translation and some commentaries in Hebrew coming from Europe and after the time of Maimonides, but also a few copies Arabic and Hebrew letters. We have also the Hafod is very incisive refutation of the principles of the philosophers on certain issues. Made an impact. His Mizan al-Amal, his ethical work, was also well read. His Ajwiba, this collection of questions and answers, has a Hebrew version which also was quite popular. Even the Mishkat al-Anwar, this sort of mystical or semi-mystical or mystically philosophical investigation into the light verse, had a Hebrew audience and was translated twice. But then, as I said, there are that's only a small portion of the Ghazalian corpus, and some of the claims that were made deal with other texts which have little or no presence in Hebrew letters, and I'll be talking about them in other segments of this talk. Thank you very much. We'll be with you in a minute. Okay, now in this second segment, I'd like to survey some of the earlier explorations into Al-Ghazali's purported possible influence on Maimonides. I will not do it in chronological order, and of course I can only mention a few publications and not go into much detail, but I think this should give us a general idea. First one is actually just a few hundred years after Maimonides, and in some ways the most penetrating, by Ibn Taymiyyah, the Sunni theologian, who equally despised both Maimonides and Al-Ghazali. And in his Dar Ta'arud, he wrote, and you have this now on your screen, he wrote, Moses ben Maimon, author of the Guide of the Perplexed, he was for the Jews what Abu Hamid al-Ghazali was for the Muslims, combined prophetic views with philosophic views by interpreting the former according to the latter. Ibn Taymiyyah was not an historian and had no interest in speaking about the influence of one on the other. He just saw a common sense of purpose, which is what I think many people find, and I find a lot in common in that way. And I think that that's the safe path. to make a comparison between Maimonides and Ghazali as two people with, say, commitments to theology and to scripture and to philosophy, and each trying in their own way to maintain those two commitments, is, I think, a very valid point. The problems come when we try to show actual influence, and to say that something in Maimonides is a direct result of his reading something by Ghazali, something which has not been shown yet. As I mentioned in the first segment, one of perhaps the first academic article to look into this was by the great Ghazali scholar Chavalas Yafa, who I think was quite hopeful that she would be able to show some influence. But in the short article written in Tarbitz in Hebrew, she came to the conclusion that she simply could not come to the conclusion that Ghazali influenced Maimonides. And I translate here her conclusion from Hebrew. She writes, "Neither the approach nor the language of our Ghazali are recognizable in the words of Maimonides, even in the noteworthy examples that I adduced above. The starting points, the initial hypotheses, the background, whatever you want, of Al-Ghazali and his overall approach are also very different than those of Maimonides." Of course, she holds out hope that someone else will find some textual comparisons that can cement this influence, but so far it hasn't happened. The next item I would like to talk about is the wonderful introduction by Shlomo Pinas, this very long essay on the sources of the guide, which is part of the introduction to his translation of the guide. Now, today, if I would, this is nothing at all like an index of works cited, simply a list of books, which are all too often what we find today. This is a reasoned, detailed, penetrating essay into the positions and the philosophical underpinnings of the positions, and detailed, sensitive comparisons between Maimonides and all of his named sources, and perhaps here and there some that aren't named. It's significant that Ghazali does not have an entry here, even though, let's say, Ibn Sina, who's also not mentioned in the guide, has a long entry. Ghazali is subsumed in the relatively long section of this essay that deals with the Kalam. And here Pinas says, and I will first read, and it's on your screen too, what his opinion is. No absolutely certain answer can be given to the question of Maimonides. Here he's talking here mainly about the possible influence of the Ghazali's Tahafut, his critique, destruction of the philosophers. However, the probabilities are that at the time of the writing of the guide, Maimonides had read the celebrated work. No philosopher who wished to keep abreast of the intellectual debate of this period could have afforded not to have done so, and such a lacuna in Maimonides' knowledge of Arabic theological literature would have been most uncharacteristic. This is probably the best worded version of a statement we come across over and over again, that Maimonides must have read Al-Ghazali. Pinas then brings a few places where he sees that things in the Tahafut would have been congenial to Maimonides, or things that Maimonides wrote, Ghazali would have been found congenial to his point of view, and also he points out some significant differences. But again, in this essay, this segment of the essay, which deals with the Kalam, he can do no more than that. Now, it's interesting that about 25 years after Pinas published his translation in 1963, that is in the 80s, Michael Schwartz of Tel Aviv University published a two-part extensive survey of Maimonides' use of the Kalam, something that Pinas was unable to do, I think largely because the sources had not, for the most part, been published at the time he was working on it. And this is one of the major landmarks in Maimonidean scholarship of the last generation. And Ghazali has a very minimal presence there. He's mentioned only a few times, never named as a source or given a prominent position. So a So Pinas it subsumes Ghazali in the discussion of the Kalam. Maimonides does not mention the Mutakalimun whom he cites. And when we have Michael Schwartz conduct his thorough study of the Kalam sources used by Maimonides, Ghazali has a minimal presence, nothing at all to indicate any direct influence. It's also, I think, significant that in the index of work cited to his Hebrew translation of the guide, which was published much later, I think in the late 90s, early 2000s, there are about 15, 20 references to Ghazali. Again, I must emphasize, none of these works are cited in the guide. Maimonides never, ever cites Ghazali. These are citations in the footnotes where Schwartz, or perhaps some of the secondary sources that he cites, saw there was some reason to compare what Maimonides wrote to what Ghazali wrote. And I said of these 15 to 20 citations, about half or more than half are the Maqasid, which I mentioned would be the most likely candidate, though no one in the latest spew of works on Ghazali's purported influence of Maimonides, so as I recall, mentions the Maqasid. The Ihya is not mentioned at all, not even once, as it should not be. And the Hafid is only mentioned a few times, but I don't think that, particularly in the question of the world's creation, where one would have expected Ghazali to be important, and with some of Maimonides' later interpreters, such as Abravanel, explicitly make use of Ghazali. I don't think anyone has been able to show that Maimonides' arguments against eternalism are influenced by Ghazali. Finally, let me mention the a long forgotten study by someone by the name of Martin Stanley Stern, published in 1979 in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, something which I don't think is really never cited anymore in Maimonidean literature, but someone who I think applied a much more rigorous methodology than the studies that have appeared lately. And in this study, which he compared Ghazali, Maimonides, and Ibn Pakuda on repentance, he came to the conclusion that the parallels that one can find between these three thinkers are the result of a common perception of the psychological processes inherent in man and a shared world view. That's to say, these people all have a lot in common. And again, go back to the study of Chava Lazarus Yaffa, her method, if one can call it that, of trying to discern influences of Ghazali Maimonides was to first find parallel passages and then press the inquiry forward. But one of the things that led her to conclude, in my opinion, correctly, that one cannot claim influence is that so many of these views that were shared by Maimonides and Ghazali were shared by many other people as well. So we need a lot more to go on if we're going to make a veritable or even a suggestive claim for Ghazali's influence on Maimonides, something that has not been done yet. In the next segments, I'll look at some of the more recent studies and some of the claims that are made there. Thank you very much for your attention. Okay, so now we're back for the third segment, which I will have a close look at two claims that have been made concerning Ghazali and his presence in Hebrew literature, his influence on Maimonides. Two claims which I think I can refute with a high degree of probability. I'm not picking on these scholars because I don't like their research. Quite to the contrary, I praise them for having done what one should do and make concrete claims that can be checked and, if necessary, falsified. The problem with so much of what is published on Ghazali's purported influence on Maimonides is that it's, as I said, mushy, wispy, simply slapping texts from the two authors in parallel columns, one after the other, and saying, "Hey, look, how can this not mean that Maimonides was influenced?" And it's so hard to, get a handle on just what the claim is that you can't really investigate it. So the first one actually does nothing to do with Maimonides, but it's, as far as I know, the only claim in print naming a specific passage in, not even a passage, a snippet in the Ihya Ulumuddin, and claiming that it has a translation, or specifically a calque, in the writing of an ethical will by Judah ibn Tibbon, the father of Shmuel ibn Tibbon, the man who translated the guide from Arabic into Hebrew. It's published in an article by a scholar by the name of S.J. Pierce, and I will put these full references in the notes to the video. So the claim, and here I'll put the text on the screen so you can follow along as I give my analysis and my counterclaim. So the claim is that in this letter, where Judah ibn Tibbon cites an anonymous source from the wisdom literature, in the Hebrew, Hachacham Ha'aravi, the Arabic, the wise Arab, who said in Hebrew, HaChochmot Shtayim, Chochmata Torot, Chochmata Gufot. The sciences are two, the science of religions and the science of bodies. The claim was that the source was in Al-Ghazali's Ihya, in the section called Qawaid al-Aqaid, which reads, Al-Islam wal-Iman hikmani ukhrawi wa dunyawi. Now, it's clear to those of you who know Arabic, this is far from a literal translation, and the scholar who wrote this, Ms. Pierce, knows that very well. But it seems to her to be close enough that with some applying some literary theory and the notion of calque and things of the sort, one can find that the statement by Ibn Tibbon is really deriving from the Ihya. Now, as I said, in the first instance, I'm suspicious of any claim concerning the Ihya, since, as I've said already several times, there's no evidence of it having been read by any Jewish author or having any presence in Hebrew or Judeo-Arabic literature up to and including the time of Maimonides. But beyond that, to think that someone would have gone through this Ihya, which, as you know, is a huge multi-volume work, just to pull out a wise saying, a witty saying that today we would probably get from some anthology of wise sayings, it makes really no sense. But fortunately, I think we can identify the true source. As you see in the third text on your screen, there is a hadith, which a hadith marfu, a hadith that has been established to go back to the Prophet Muhammad, which is exactly the Hebrew, that the Hebrew snippet is an exact literal translation, except for perhaps switching the order of the two sciences, al-ilm al-mani, ilm al-abdani, ilm al-adyani, except for putting first the science of bodies and afterwards the science of religions. It's literal sentence, but it's more than that. As a hadith, it is cited all over the place, and it's cited not necessarily as a hadith. It's in bell letter, in some sort of the story concerning the Caliph Harun al-Rashid. So we have here, first, to begin with, the initial suspicion that the Ihya is not known, and of all things to use the Ihya for as a source for this, what he's saying, it sounds odd. Second, identification of an Arabic source, which is literally the same thing as the Hebrew text. No need to talk about calques or anything. And of course, the genre, both belonging to something that, even though it may have began as a hadith, or maybe before it became a hadith, it was sort of a belletristic apogee, or whatever you call it. So I think we can pretty much dismiss this. And again, all credit goes to the scholar, Dr. Pierce, for having made a specific claim where one can dig into the matter and see if one can come up with a better explanation, and I think I have. The second claim has to do with a different book of Al-Ghazali, his very famous Spiritual Autobiography Al-Munqidh min Ad-Dalal. This is the book in which Al-Ghazali tells about his own personal journey in which he eventually found the kind of religious salvation and tranquility of a sort, and it's something that simply met his specific religious urges in Sufism. Now, this book, now, I had not known of any citation whatsoever or mentioning of Munqidh min Ad-Dalal in Hebrew literature until I came across some information in an article by Paul Fenton, whose name I mentioned in the earlier videos, an article having to do with the great mystic Al-Hallaj. And he has a chance to say something more about the sources available to scholars and I would say, the reciprocal obligations. The sources have been made available through generous funding and very dedicated work by teams of experts at the Microphone Institute in Jerusalem and the Friedberg Geniza project, which now has several other projects under its belt as well. But both of these projects depend in some measure on scholars themselves feeding back. There was someone like Fenton who does lots and lots of work on Geniza and other materials and has discovered many things, made many identifications, really should make the effort to give this information, make this information available, not just in publications where not everyone will get to, but on the website of the Friedberg project, which is called jewishmanuscripts.org, or by writing to the staff at the Microfilm Institute so that they can update it. So we do have from Fenton, I know of a couple of fragments of a Munqidh min Ad-Dalal, Arabic and Hebrew letters. I don't know of any, don't know their dates or whether they antedate Maimonides or not, but in any case, it seems to me highly unlikely that of all the things that Maimonides would have read by Ghazali, it would have been this biography, and which led Ghazali onto a spiritual track, which was actually quite different from Maimonides, who rejected Sufism, or the so-called the Hasidim, the Jewish Sufism, for a number of reasons. In any event, a scholar at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, she's now retired but still very active in writing, Sarah Stumza, has claimed that a snippet in Maimonides' Epistle to Yemen alludes to Al-Munqidh min Ad-Dalal. You see here that in the first line, I put it in Judeo-Arabic, where Maimonides, speaking of the Torah, calls it Kitabahu, that is his, God's book, Al-Hadi Lana, Al-Munqidh Lana min Ad-Dalala, wa min Al-Ara Al-Fasida. And she says that this snippet is an allusion to Ghazali's book on Munqidh min Ad-Dalal. Now again, there is good reason for initial resistance, not just because Maimonides, as far as you know, would not have read this book, and I don't know that any Sufi book has been shown to have been read by him or cited by him. But it's totally out of place in this epistle, which is written to the Jewish community in Yemen, who are in serious problems with a false Messiah and conversion pressures from some very activist Muslims, to refer to Ghazali's book here. And if he did have any reason to let his readers know that he has read Ghazali's autobiography and it somehow made an impact on him, I think he would have found a better way to do it than to simply hint at the title in the course of this epistle. But again, we can also suggest an alternative. Here, it's not as plain and clear as it was in the first example, but I think I can make a strong case for it. The Quran, in 3 places, uses the word dalala. Now, here's the first instance, the first difference. The Maimonides speaks of dalala. This is the feminine form, And Ghazali's book has Al-Munkath and Dalal. Maybe a minor difference, but if we're going to do precise textual studies, we should pay attention to it. And the Quran, in at least 3 places, uses this word. Not only that, but it uses it in conjunction, or I should say, in opposition to words for guidance, hidayah or huda. As you see here in the verse that I've selected from Surah Al-Baqarah, Ulaika alladhina ishtaru al-dalala bil-huda, the people who sold their true guidance, al-huda, in exchange for dalala, for guidance towards error. And you see here that in Maimonides' snippet, he also has the 2 words in essentially the same thing, Kitab al-Hadi, Al-Munkath lana min al-dalala. On top of that, while, as I said, there is very good reason to be suspicious of the claim that Maimonides had read Al-Munkath min al-Dalal, there is no reason at all to be suspicious of the claim that Maimonides is using Quranic language, because this is something that's been substantiated and ascertained in a slew of studies, at least a half dozen, if not more, instances where Maimonides uses Quranic language. And I myself have made found a few additional places. So we have here in the first place the more precise usage of the forms of dalala, not dalal. Second, we have dalala used in opposition to hidayah or huda or hadi. And third, we have here the Quranic usage, and Maimonides is known to have studied the Quran when he was living as a crypto Muslim, and the sources tell us that even though his whole conversion was a farce and not really, but one thing Maimonides did do in those years when he was in the face of it, living as a Muslim, was study the Quran, and we have Quranic language, al-rasikhun fil ilm and things like that in his writings. And so we have at least 3 reasons to prefer seeing in the source of this phrase, if we need a source, if we take the theory of intertextuality to tell us that everything is coming from somewhere, we have at least 3 reasons to prefer the Quranic source over the title of Ghazali's book. So that's it. Now in the final segment, or the one before the coda, I will attempt to deal with one of the more widely cited, and certainly the lengthiest attempt to show Ghazali's influence in what I have called wispy and slippery fashion. We'll see what we can do with that in the next segment. Thank you very much. In this section of the video, I'm going to address what I've called the more nebulous or slippery claims. By that I mean that I can't see here a piece of text that I can get hold of and put on the screen and take apart as I did in the previous segment. It's more a question of matching or showing side by side some passages from Maimonides and some Ghazali, acknowledging the differences, acknowledging that Ghazali is not cited, and yet making an argument for influence. Claim can be made stronger, weaker, but the comparison, which, as I've said all along, is a worthy undertaking, and I've seen an interesting paper comparing Maimonides with Confucian ethics. But why, when we take the step forward, the great leap forward into the claim for influence, that's where I want to check things out more closely. And that brings me to my second point, what I've called social negotiation, meaning the reliance or citation on other people who have done things of the same sort. Now, and I'll be giving some examples, some pointed examples in a few minutes. Now, you can justifiably ask me, well, wait a minute. In academia, aren't we always supposed to cite earlier research? And isn't this research done by established scholars who have published in peer-reviewed journals, whose papers have been scrutinized by other peers. Yes, that's true. But I think that, a good scholar, a good investigator would always want to get at the bottom of things. And even if a paper builds on previous research, maybe that previous research is a bit shaky. And my claim all along here is that there has been no proof whatsoever, no textual proof that is indisputable or even very, very suggestive that Maimonides read anything by Ghazali, was influenced by him in any meaningful way. And therefore, it seems to me that we're on the direction towards building a house of cards in which one speculative article is built on other speculative articles, and the whole thing is floating on air. Now, I'll be talking here about two articles in particular, one by Amira Iran on Maimonides and Ghazali on the pleasures of the afterlife, because it's one of the longest pieces on this particular topic, and a paper that she builds upon in what I've called social negotiation rather than standard citation, a paper by my friend and colleague Steve Harvey on Al-Ghazali and Maimonides. And I should also say that the social negotiation here is a bit more complex, because Iran actually has what I think is an interesting thesis, if it could be found to have some basis in fact, and that is that Maimonides' previous claims that Maimonides had been influenced by Ibn Sina are problematic. But if we see the Avicennan materials having been mediated to Maimonides by way of Al-Ghazali, then the influence it becomes more apparent, or the comparison becomes more revealing. An interesting thesis, but the papers on Avicenna's supposed influence of Maimonides are, I think, no less speculative. So, as I've said, we're sort of like off on a magic carpet ride with I'd like to have our feet on the ground. Now, Dr. Iran begins her paper, as do just about, as I've said, just about everyone, acknowledging, and as I quote here from one of the paragraphs at the beginning, I shall focus on the possible influence of Al-Ghazali on Maimonides, which has already been noticed by scholars. That's what I call the social negotiation. She's building on previous research, so we don't have to be as picky with her as we would have been with someone else. Despite the fact that Maimonides never mentions Al-Ghazali, true, either directly or indirectly. And the main source that she cites in the footnote to that passage is the paper by Stephen Harvey. Stephen Harvey compares the books of knowledge, the Sefer HaMadah, book of knowledge, which Maimonides put at the front of his great law code, the Mishnah Torah, Kitab al-Ilm, the book of knowledge, which Al-Ghazali put at the head of his great compilation, Ahya Lumadin, which, as I've said in previous segments, has been claimed to have been a source for Maimonides, but there's no evidence of this whatsoever. And particularly, Steve looks at the discussion of the relationship between the student and the teacher. Now, I can't, again, go through the whole paper piece by piece. Steve, as I said, as does Dr. Iran, has passages and says that they're different in some ways, the same in other ways. But towards the end of the paper, he has a list of of some 6 conclusions, which I would like to summarize for you and discuss. He says, first of all, it is possible to account for Maimonides' various teachings on the basis of Jewish sources alone. Maimonides, quote, lived amidst the people who prefaced legal works with a book of knowledge that included sections on the duties of student and teacher. So, quote, we must begin to consider influence. And that by then comparing the Maimonides and Ghazali, we make the case for influence, quote, even more compelling. He goes on to refer to a work by Franz Rosenthal, certainly one of the great scholars of the previous generation, who had claimed that Maimonides' Book of Knowledge is, quote, a summary in miniature of Ghazali's Kitab al-Ilm, a statement which Steve Harvey and I think just what everyone would agree is going too far. But Steve also adds that Isidore Tversky is correct in emphasizing the novelty of Maimonides' Book of Knowledge, and the argument for Ghazali's influence does not question this emphasis. We can have both Maimonides being innovating and being influenced. But then, of course, this would raise the question that I've been asking all along, well, what does it mean, influence? Where precisely does his influence come in a way that doesn't interfere with the novelty or the Jewish sources? Point to be pondered. And finally, Professor Tversky's remark that the most important source of Maimonides' code is, quote, his fertile mind and skill of analysis and synthesis. I am strongly in agreement with Professor Tversky that we should be paying attention at Maimonides, and not just Maimonides, but all great writers at their novelty and their own way of thinking, rather than looking always for influences and sources. But the greatest source of the Mishnah Torah is the Jewish legal tradition, written sources, which Maimonides incorporated, edited, changed, and went on in his book. Now, I am not averse to acknowledging that he has made use here of his knowledge of non-Jewish sources, and I myself, as a little point which is not relevant here, on his discussion on the preparation of cooking of food on the Sabbath, which I think comes from Ibn Sina, but that's not for here. I would just like to leave the Book of Knowledge with a point that I heard from the great Professor Pinas, and since I'm getting along in years myself, I think I should pass this on. That Pinas felt that Maimonides' Book of Knowledge, which is a schematic the presentation of physics, metaphysics, ethics, and so on, something which is not at all as precise as what Maimonides would have written in the guide, answers really to Plato's request, or that the law codes be prefaced by some general knowledge about what it's all about, which is the general populace should have, and before we lay the law down for them, so they can sort of understand, what's going on and how the law code fits into the world that we live in. But as I said, Steve Harvey and the sources he cites are all, basically speculative, presenting text matched side by side, differences, similarities, no solid proof of Ghazali having influenced Maimonides. Now, in the case of Dr. Ilan, again, I can't go through here the many sources that she brings. I don't want to split hairs with her or nitpick, even though I have some criticism of translations from the Arabic and things of the sort. But I would say, first of all, that there are some points of detail which are significant. And speaking of metaphors of bodily senses, bodily sensation with regard to divine matters, Ghazali mentions also the sense of touch. This is something that Maimonides would never do. Maimonides felt, basing himself on a passage in Aristotle, that the sense of touch and all sensual pleasures that derive from one body touching another are a disgrace to humanity, something that we should be embarrassed about. And he would never have used, or I think he would have sort of rejected out of hand any book or any discussion which makes appeals to the sense of touch, along with, of course, the senses of sight, hearing, and smell, which do have to do with gathering knowledge. Another I think, significant difference is Ghazali's use of the two terms ilm and marifa, ilm being more discursive knowledge, and marifa, the more an agnostic type of revelation, a distinction which is not found in Maimonides. And above all, the essential difference between the scriptural traditions, which both had to deal with in dealing with the afterlife. When Ghazali speaks about the intellectual pleasures of the afterlife, he is really speaking the names of the philosophers whose position he rejects, because being a devout Muslim, he cannot ignore, reject, or explain away the many explicit descriptions of the sensual pleasures in the afterlife, something which he accepts as fact and which he tries to justify. Maimonides says nothing of the sort. He has no need to do so. because there's nothing in the Jewish sources, biblical or even extra biblical, that demands this. And of course, he himself would never endorse anything of the sort. So this is a very essential difference between the two, and I think that it should be it's enough to raise serious questions about the comparisons that have been made. Dr. Ilan towards the end speaks of an essential affinity between Maimonides and Ghazali, which I question, and then goes on herself to point out to some differences or basic differences between the two. Basically, with Ghazali being more of a mystic and Maimonides being more of an Aristotelian. In fact, that distinction is something I think that Maimonides does not devalue the experiential side of religion. He speaks about it in a number of places, but overall, I think that these comparative studies may have some value in their own. It's always educational, instructive to compare the writings of two great thinkers, especially when, like Maimonides and Ghazali, they are both trying to make comprehensive, coherent statements of the positions of their faiths on the great issues of the day, not to simply reject out of hand claims that are not congenial or they're conflicting with their basic religious beliefs, but on the other hand, not to concede anything that is found to be essential. And I think that there's a lot to be learned by comparing the two. But my question all along is, what is the need, since there is no evidence for influence, what is the need driving this, which I think is something that ought to be pondered. Well, I'm going to have a few words to say in a coda, and hopefully leave you with some things to think about, because that's what we're supposed to be doing here. Thank you. Hi. Now, in this final section, a short coda, I just want to summarize what I've been doing and leave you with my closing thoughts, as you saw in the title, as an historian. What I've tried to trace here is the development of an issue in the history of philosophy. Claims are an issue of the possible influence of Al-Ghazali and Maimonides, which began as a research question on the part of Chava Latzos Yaffa. Did Al-Ghazali influence Maimonides? To which he answered no, and along the way morphed into a sort of research project, postulating that Al-Ghazali influenced Maimonides, and then trying to bolster or prove this through a variety of means, none of which seems to me to be sound historical methodology. As I've said all along, it's not impossible that Al-Ghazali influenced Maimonides, but so far there's been no concrete evidence of this. A comparison between Maimonides and Al-Ghazali is a wonderful thing to do in the history of philosophy, or in philosophy without the word history, but we get off track when we start trying to show influence when we still don't have the basic data that Maimonides read anything by Al-Ghazali. And this thing, this project has morphed into a project of from a question to something which is simply a project to amass more and more evidence, most of which is comparing texts between Maimonides and Ghazali on the agreed upon assumption or agreed upon basis that A, Maimonides never cites Ghazali, B, that almost everything that has been cited as a possible influence could be explained without invoking influence, and C, almost everything that can be cited as an instance of influence, Maimonides and Ghazali don't agree. Nonetheless, with the growing mound of publications asserting or claiming in one way or another that Ghazali influenced Maimonides, it's become easier and easier to say, well, I'm simply carrying on further research. Now, there's a lot of things that may be going on behind the scenes here, not just the social negotiation and the understandable wish of historians, of scholars, let us say, who are not really professional historians, to be part of a conversation that's going on, and to be able to feed off each other's research. There may be other social, political reasons for the invaluation of Ghazali. The new image of Ghazali as being the opposite of the one that was mistakenly attributed to Goldseer as someone who had put a damper on philosophical study in Islam, in addition to the post 9/11 efforts at giving Islamic thought a very prominent position to make up for the sins of, quote, Orientalism and so on. I don't want to take any position on those issues. I'm just saying that as a sort of nuts and bolts historian, I try to keep my eye on the ball. And I will just end with that, because this is really my main issue here is my discomfort with all this as an historian. I did my doctorate in history of science and have been for several decades been doing mainly history of science, but sort of branching out in the history of philosophy and history of religious thought, which have a lot of overlapping with the history of medieval science. And I know a lot of people in the field, people I studied with, people I've met in conferences and whatnot. And as far as I know, I am the only person who comes to this field with a background in history. My BA was in history, and I consider myself to be primarily an historian. And I think that there's a feeling around that you don't really have to, history is not an art that one has to learn. To work in Arabic text, everyone agrees you have to study Arabic and you have to study Hebrew. And if I put a Hebrew or Arabic or Greek text on the screen and you can't read it, then you know that you really can't say anything about what I'm talking about. If I were to do a complicated astronomical diagram, mathematical formula, or some logical one of the forms of the syllogism, and this is something that you don't have the technical training in, you know that it's beyond your capacity to take a stand. But history, it's just nursery rhymes, right? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. What more is there to that? So since Ghazali lived before Maimonides, so we can't say that Maimonides influenced Ghazali, and since they talk about the same issues, and since we can compare the passages and find some overlap, something in common, and since there is no accepted criterion for determining influence, there's nothing to it. And I think there is something to it. As an historian, I think, first of all, that in general, there's been far too much emphasis on the identification of sources and the search for influence. My personal professional opinion as an historian is that our first task in understanding and dealing with the thinker, whether it be Ghazali, Maimonides, or anyone else, is to understand what they are saying, what their issue is, what their position is on the issues of the day, and questions of sources or influences are ancillary. They should be brought into the picture to the extent that they are needed to understand the position taken on a given issue. And I'd just like to end this with a plea. History is a profession, an art, a craft that requires training no less than other disciplines. And I think that rather than sort of going into this with taking on projects on showing that A influenced B without really being sure why is this an important question or how am I going to answer it, is something that gets us off on the wrong track. So let me just end this with the historian's plea to give history its due credit and demand of us all to refine our understandings of history. What is historical methodology? What are the questions we ask? Are we really do we want to go right away to the question of did A influence B, or when does that come into the picture, and what does that question seek to enlighten? So I'm leaving you here with the plea of an historian that let's give history as a profession, in the discipline it's due. Thank you very much for your patience.